On behalf of the Board of Trustees and the staff of the Indiana Historical Society, I'm honored to welcome you to the 2024 Founders Day. Founders Day is a program we have done for decades, bringing in folks who have made a difference in Indiana history and who have helped forward the cause of history throughout their lifetimes. This year, we are pleased to welcome A'Lelia Bundles and Dr. Tyrone Friedman as our guests. Both have made significant contributions to the IHS and to the field of history at large, and we're proud to have them here today. I hope our partnership with them and with you will continue for many years. Thank you for supporting the Indiana Historical Society and Indiana history. Please enjoy the program.
Thank you very much, Jody. I'm A'Lelia Bundles. I'm Madam C.J. Walker's great-great-granddaughter and biographer and a native of Indianapolis.
And hello, I'm Tyrone McKinley Freeman, and I am a professor of philanthropic studies and Africana studies and author of Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy During Jim Crow.
Tyrone and I are always happy to be in this building,
Yes.
and we really love talking to each other, so we are delighted that we have been invited to be a part of Founders Day 2024. We've both done a lot of research in this building, but we really met many years ago.
Yes, we did. I was a doctoral student and thinking about studying Madam C.J. Walker from the standpoint of her philanthropy, and I wasn't quite sure where to start. And I had come over here a little bit and looked through some things, and then I learned that you were coming to campus. And so my mentor, Dr. Dwight Burlingame, introduced me to you through email, and you were so gracious. You were about to do a keynote on the 4th floor of the Student Center. And you agreed to meet with me a few minutes before then. And we sat right outside in that lobby area by the escalator. And I asked you about studying and looking at her philanthropy. And you said, oh, interesting idea. There's gifts and stuff in my book. I was like, yeah, of course. You said, but there's something about those women in St. Louis. Take a look at St. Louis and what she was doing there, and that might get you going. And you were absolutely right. That opened up a whole world for me, and I'm just very grateful. And we've been fast friends ever since. I appreciate the way that you've shared archives and reviewed chapters, and we've done panels together, and just really count you as a friend and companion in this journey. So thank you.
Well, and I'm just really grateful for all the work you've done, because while on her own ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker tried to give a broad sweep of Madam Walker's life, since there had not been a major biography of her. I love how you really did a deep dive into her philanthropy, into her involvement with women's organizations, looking at Madam Walker as an educator, because you've brought your scholarship as a student and as a professor of philanthropy that gives it an entirely new dimension.
Thank you very much. You blazed the trail, so I'm happy to extend them or expand them, so but thank you. Yeah.
Well, and we both are really lucky that the Madam Walker papers are here at the Indiana Historical Society. 40,000 documents have been digitized, more than 100 archival boxes. But the story of how the papers got here, most people really don't know.
Right.
And it really started in the 1970s. Violet Reynolds was the longtime secretary for the Walker Company. She had started working for Madam Walker in 1916, I think, when she was still a teenager. And the building on Indiana Avenue was really starting to deteriorate. The neighborhood had started to deteriorate after the highways came through and all of the redlining in the neighborhood. And the building was really suffering.
Right.
And Tom Roomer, who was working here at the Indiana Historical Society, came to visit Mrs. Reynolds in the Walker Building. And in boxes and rooms, there were all of these papers, all of these photographs, all of these advertisements. And he began to steward this conversation with Mrs. Reynolds, who at that point was in her 80s and was very, very protective of everything. Just what do you want? How are you going to do this? And fortuitously, around this same time, Gail Thornbrough was the executive secretary. And they were beginning to look at how they could diversify the collection. And they realized what a gem there was with all of these uncatalogued papers that were decades old. And it took about 3 years, finally, with Lilly money, the Lilly Endowment, the stock that came from Mr. Lilly's grandson, Just all of the things, all of the pieces fell together at a perfect time. And in 1982, these papers were donated to the Indiana Historical Society.
Wow. And I love that story because it contains so many elements of the problem of the archives, that there is an unfortunate history where historical societies, museums, libraries, these institutions that are charged with preserving history and culture didn't want Black archives.
Yeah, true.
Right? They didn't value them. They didn't think there was a history to capture. There was a stereotype that Black folks did not have a history, right? So there's not worth keeping their items, their material culture. And so it created a lot of struggles and missed opportunities because we do have a history, we do have artifacts, they were out there. And it took people like Arturo Schomburg, who was of Afro-Caribbean descent and came to the United States in the 1890s. And he knew that we had a history. He started knocking on doors and gathering and collecting items to tell this history, which is now, of course, part of the Schomburg collection at New York Public Library in Harlem. And people like Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Black History Month, the same thing, right? Denied access, even though he had a PhD from Harvard, as a Black man, denied access to libraries and archives. He started collecting in the community, knocking on doors, interacting with formerly enslaved people who had their manumission papers and other things that they needed, and really begin building their own archives. And this is really important. But then we get to the 1960s and 70s when there's this kind of activist archival movement in cultural institutions, saying, no, wait a minute, these communities are valuable and we need to be collecting, we need to be more inclusive and more expansive. And that opens up and creates pathways that lead us here today. So it's an incredible story that reflects this larger tensions in this, but it's such how fortunate we are that the IHS kept pursuing those papers and that we still benefit from them all these years later.
Well, you just think about what was missed, all of the things that were discarded because somebody thought nobody really cares about this.
Yeah.
But we have these items. Well, I just know from my own experience, growing up in Indianapolis, I went to Washington Township Public Schools. I got an excellent education, but there was no Black history and no women's history really in my school experience. And when I was in elementary school, I was very attracted to a biography series that was published by Bobbs Merrill, an Indianapolis publishing company. And I remember reading about Amelia Earhart and Louisa May Alcott and Knute Rockne, who was the coach at Notre Dame. So, but there were I didn't read anything about any Black women in that collection. There was, I found out later there were maybe two people, maybe Mary McLeod Bethune and Harriet Tubman, but they were not in my library.
Right.
Fast forward to high school, I'm in my history class. I think it was probably an AP history class. And my memory is that the only time Black people were mentioned in that history book they were Negroes and they were slaves, not enslaved people as we say now,
yes.
but slaves who were contented. And that word contented is actually in the history book. Right. And what it left out, I knew in my bones, as one of the only maybe one or two Black kids in the class, it made me feel really uncomfortable. But I didn't have any documentation to fight back with. But my grandfather was a lawyer and he was a student of history. And he's the one who planted the seeds. So I just want to show you a few of the images, a few of the things that he sort of shared with me that began to help me open the doors to teach myself history because I was not learning it in school. So of course, Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker their collection is here at the archives. But that was still, at that point, in little nooks and crannies in the building in Indianapolis as far as we knew, nobody was really interested in it except us. But my grandfather, who is here, Marion Perry, and my grandmother, May Walker Perry, were really kind of the place that was my entry, my doorway into history. And my grandmother had died in 1945, but she lived in an apartment at 213 Northwest Street, or West North Street, 213 West North Street. That building is actually still there. And my grandfather was living in that apartment. I was born in 1952. When I was 3 years old, my parents and I moved back to Indianapolis. And I remember as my grandfather and my mother would sit in the living room and talk, I would go into the bedroom that had been my grandmother's bedroom. And I opened up the dresser drawers, and in those dresser drawers, there were mother of pearl opera glasses and ostrich feather fans and these little miniature mummy charms that A'Lelia Walker, Madam Walker's daughter, had brought back from Cairo in 1922. Wow. And that was like, as a little kid, before I could even read, I was starting to see this history. And really what I realized many years later is that after A'Lelia Walker died in 1931, my grandmother had packed up her apartment and her townhouse in New York and moved things to this apartment in Indianapolis. And so my grandmother May was actually adopted by A'Lelia Walker when she was 12 years old. Her family was from Noblesville. They were part of the free people of color who migrated from North Carolina to Indiana in the 1830s. So I feel like I have really deep Indiana roots, but that I was not learning that when I was in high school.
Right.
But so that part of the story I did not know, and I could have talked back to the teacher and given something different. But my grandfather also talked about his parents, Ida Robinson and Marion Perry, Marion Perry Sr., who was valedictorian of his class at your alma mater, Lincoln University, in the 1880s.
Go Lions.
He was very, yes, go Lions. He was very, very proud of his grandfather, Henderson B. Robinson, who had been a free person of color in Ohio, moved to Memphis right before the Civil War, and then moved to Arkansas, and where he became superintendent of prisons in Helena, Arkansas, and elected to the state legislature. So another point of history that I was not taught in school, Black people in Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the evil thing of scallywags and carpetbaggers, but my grandfather was very proud of his family heritage with an elected person who had been elected to office. But he was even more excited to show me these free papers.
Okay.
So these are free papers for Delphi, the mother of Henderson B. Robinson, whose mother, Rose, had her with a white owner, John Hendry, and John Hendry promised Rose that Delphi would be free. Rose actually bought Delphi's freedom, but after Hendry died, the county in Tennessee would not allow her to be free because it said you cannot emancipate slaves. And there was actually a lawsuit. So he had preserved these free papers. And then his great-grandmother, who was married to Henderson B. Robinson, is in this picture, Adelaide Rochester. And Adelaide Rochester had free papers. These are her free papers from New Orleans, and she was a hairdresser. So these are the kinds of things that are in people's attics, but people weren't sure that anybody cared about them. But that's how I came to really begin to understand Black history. Right. Now, you and I, you're a little younger than I am, and so your experience is different and very, very interesting.
Yeah, a little different. But you know, for me, the introduction came through my family, through church and community. I can remember being a child of the 70s and 80s, you know, really being exposed to, you know, every Black household had their obligatory copies of Ebony and Jet magazine. And because of people like Lerone Bennett Jr. there on staff, they always had historical articles and things like that. Essence came along later. My church had a lot of educational programs along with, you know, Sunday school and vacation Bible school. They took it very seriously that they needed to teach the children Black history, right? And so we did all types of plays. As a kid, I didn't want to be in all these plays, but I'm grateful now. But they exposed us to this history, and it made it alive for us in a way that just wasn't happening in the schools. And then also, the larger culture was beginning to reflect this. I'm part of the hip hop generation. And so we had groups like Public Enemy and Poor Righteous Teachers and X-Clan and others, Queen Latifah. You would see pictures of Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey in their music videos or in their lyrics. So they were very much bringing history forward, and it became fashionable. We used to wear Africa medallions around our necks, right? And we would have images of great figures from Black history on our t-shirts or our jeans. So it was something we were aspiring to grab a hold of. And I also think about In my high school, we had an organization called the Martin Luther King Jr. Association. And it was basically the Black Student Union. I should say I'm from South Orange, New Jersey, and went to Columbia High School there. And it was a top high school, top public high school in the state, but it wasn't addressing Black history. So we used the MLK Association to bring in a local historian from the community college, Dr. Linworth Gunther, and he did a series for us after school. So imagine a classroom of 40 kids, 40 teenagers who are, intentionally staying after school to take another class, right? Because there's so much engaged with this history and want to capture it and recover it for themselves. So that's very much the environment that I grew up in and where these kinds of connections began for me.
Well, when you mentioned JET, it just makes me think of Johnson Publishing and really the important role that they played. And so where you were able to turn on CW or turn on the TV and you could see all kinds of shows, the Cosby Show, but even before that, the many shows that were on. I'm old enough that I remember that we would get JET every week and you'd go to the back page and it would list whatever shows had Black people on it. I mean, there were so few that they could actually say, oh, the Nat King Cole is on, or,
Right.
you're gonna
That's
see,
right.
this movie.
That's
So
right.
I totally remember that. But also books like Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett,
Yes.
that Johnson Publishing was publishing when the larger publishing industry was really not paying attention
Yes.
to books by or about Black people. Not that they weren't being written, but they weren't being published. But I remember getting, first editions of Before the Mayflower, of Martin Luther King, We Cannot Wait, books like that, because my uncle was good friends with the librarian at Johnson Publishing. So people were learning history, and churches, as you say, and even now, when we are in this moment where books are being banned and where there is a real backlash to teaching accurate American history, there are people who are making sure that their kids are learning history. They're really pushing back on that. And in some ways, you cannot put this back in the bottle. It's all over TikTok. There are books that you can order. There are all kinds of documentaries. So the stories are being told.
Absolutely. And of course, now Essence continues that tradition with What's New in Black on Netflix, right? So
Exactly.
they'll tell you what's going on.
Well, and now when you were saying the staying after school, and I was not getting this in school, but places like the Indiana Historical Society make it possible for kids to learn. The National History Day, I just love National History Day. And in the Madam Walker collection, now that it's digitized, I can send students to it and let them see something. But I do remember with the very early, soon after National History Day was created in the 80s, I got a letter, and this is before the internet, so this was an actual written letter that someone sent to me, a student in Oklahoma. And she said she wanted to do her National History Day project about Madam Walker, but her teacher didn't believe Madam Walker existed. So this was, you couldn't just Google it and find out that she existed. And so I went into overdrive.
I bet you did.
I photocopied every photo I could find. I don't know, at that point I hadn't written my young adult book, but I sent her everything I could. I talked to her on the telephone.
You almost drove out there, didn't you?
Exactly. I talked to her on the telephone, and then she won the state championship in Oklahoma and came to the nationals at University of Maryland. So that was, but when you started doing your research on Madam Walker, when you were proposing your topic for your dissertation, was that well received? What was your experience?
I had, there were definitely some folks who encouraged it, but there were a couple who didn't, and wondering why I wanted to study Madam Walker and thinking about, doing something other than Black philanthropy. And I'm glad I didn't listen. And unfortunately, that continues today. I think if you study Black history, if you're in fields like Africana studies, women's history, you'll come across naysayers who won't believe in what you're doing. And I just interacted with a doctoral student at a conference a few weeks ago, and she was conveying to me the same concern, that she has advisors who are, don't understand why she's trying to focus on Black women. And I encouraged her to push through that, and this has value. do. And this is the experience. If you study this history, you're going to run into that. So unfortunately, I had to deal with that too. But I'm glad I didn't give in, though I was tempted to, because you need support.
Right, you
This
need
is difficult
support
work.
because if you're going to get your PhD
Yeah.
and then get tenure and all of those,
All those
things.
things, yeah. But also just the process of doing this kind of study, writing books, engaging. It takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. There's a lot of moments where you can kind of step off, and ease back. But it's important to keep pushing through that. So.
But the academy has really changed.
Yes.
And that means museums have changed, historical societies have changed. I mean, you look at that sort of arc of change. I was in college from 1970 to 74. And that was really that era when women's studies and ethnic studies, African American studies, was really gaining legitimacy.
Yes.
So, but I could not have majored in history at my university and done a paper or done something on Madam Walker because it would not have been taken seriously. I mean, I remember applying for a grant from one of the humanities councils and being turned down. And when I FOIA'd the documents to see what the evaluations were, there was one scholar who said, well, this isn't really very important.
Wow. Yeah.
So we know that, but it has made such a difference for so many scholars. I mean, there are more than 200 books that I'm aware of that include Madam Walker, whether it's Cokie Roberts' We Are Our Mother's Daughters or Hillary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton's book, but I know that you know about other authors who have written books and just the impact that this collection has had.
Yeah, and we have to stop and think about that, right? Because you need the documents in order to tell these stories. And if we think about what not having access to them means, we could miss out on a lot of scholarship. And you're right, there have been so many, not only your work, I mean, you blazed the trails through these archives. I was able to do my book, but we know a lot of people, Naliwe Rooks' book on hair raising, Tiffany Gill's Beauty Shop Politics, Susanna Walker's Style and Stylist, Juliet E.K. Walker's History of Black Business, Julia Blackwelder's book, Style and Jim Crow, Kate Dodson's book, Bridging Race Divides. It just goes on and on and on. And then you think about others who've kind of built off of that. Our dear late friend, Dr. Paul Mullins, who did so much with Madam Walker's history and the neighborhoods in the city affected by her. There's just a lot of historical insight and innovation and great research and scholarship and stories we would have missed out on had not IHS continued to pursue that collection with Miss Reynolds. And that has implications. We need to pause and think about that in this moment of backlash and book banning and clamping down on DEI. What else are we at risk of not experiencing, not benefiting from if these initiatives succeed? It's a really harrowing question.
Right. And the Historical Society has a really extensive collection of African American individuals, whether it's Rufus Kuykendall or the Urban League or Lockfield. So there's quite a bit that's here.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that the Madam Walker collection is the most requested, the most accessed. And just think if that sort of old way of thinking had been here, that truly what we would have missed out on. As you sort of interrogate the archives in other places, I mean, I know that you've begun to reframe Black philanthropy in general, but also the archives themselves.
Yeah. It was important to think about how was I going to approach Madam Walker's philanthropy. And again, I get the benefit of you having already blazed trails through the archive. You've been working on that since 75.
Yeah,
You saved
yes,
me
I
26
had.
years. But you already laid out her
You're
life.
faster than I am.
You laid out her life. And so we had the parameters, so I could zoom in on what philanthropy meant in that life and as a part of that life. And so approaching the archive, even with Madam Walker's papers, that makes us aware of other dimensions of the problem of the archives, because Madam Walker's collection has limitations, omissions, a particular perspective or bias. And so our responsibility as researchers, right, is to go in and to be able to decipher those things and to triangulate with other resources to try to figure out what's really going on, what's happening here, what might have happened, what actually happened. There's so much to parse through because you can't necessarily just take things for face value. You have to do the work to figure out what's exactly happening. And so for me, there were a couple of moments in working with the archive that were helpful, and it speaks again to this history of working in archives, but building alternative archives to help you triangulate and tell out these stories, I was, looking at the Walker clubs. Madam Walker, right, was started to organize her agents into beneficial clubs in 1916. And there's correspondence between her and Freeman B. Ransom, her attorney and right-hand man, about how to set these up. And he's like, do you want these to be fraternal orders, or how are they? She's like, no, they should be like NACW, the National Association of Colored Women. And I want them to have their own money and they do their own thing, but then we'll convene nationally and that sort of thing. And so that was interesting to me. And there's some people who had published and said, yes, this is based on NACW, and which is fine. But I was just really struck. There seemed to be strong fraternal elements, and I just wanted to get a handle on that. So I went to Yale University, the Beinecke Library. I know you've spent a lot of time there too. And there was a ritual book from a Walker Club there. And I was like, wow, so I get to look at it. And I started going through and again, seeing these fraternal-like rituals and trying to make sense of them. Well, Madam Walker was a part of the Court of Calanthe, right? And Freeman B. Ransom was a part of the Knights of Pythias, right? And those two were kind of like sister and brother organizations. So I said, what's going on here? So I tracked down and found a ritual book from the Court of Calanthe from the same time period. And putting those things side to side, there were so many similarities in some places that almost seemed verbatim. I was like, okay, there's more going on here than just NACW, right? And so that opened up and allowed me to kind of add to, right, the story that's being told. And I also think about the story of her work with education. You had well documented the Lilia College and the Walker Beauty Schools that she was setting up. So when I come to them years later and I'm seeing the curriculum through the textbooks that's here, that's at the Marion County Public Library, looking at what she's trying to teach and how it's playing out, but also seeing her in relationship with people like Charlotte Hawkins Brown, right, and Mary McLeod Bethune, women who were actively building schools and who she came alongside and gave money to and really encouraged them. That gave me the lens for thinking about her as an educator who was using this as an opportunity, of course, to build the market, of course, to build the profession and build a labor force, but also to extend education for the waves of Black women who are coming northward and seeking opportunities. So again, these are ways we get to build off of previous scholarship, build off of archives, come to them with new questions and new perspectives. But again, what would have happened if they weren't here to begin with?
No, and then you're asking the scholarly, intellectual questions. So you're taking it to another level and really making sure that the Academy takes this seriously. And your work in Black philanthropy, where you've been able to use Madam Walker as a foundation to sort of interrogate that. You're doing advising in other places, so that's an outgrowth of really studying this deeply. Talk about some of that impact.
Yeah, I'm very privileged to be able to interact with giving circles, family foundations, fundraisers, professional fundraisers, foundation leaders who are all thinking about how to approach their giving, their fundraising, their grant making differently. And it's an honor and a great opportunity to share with them lessons from the Black philanthropic tradition, because it has been neglected and ignored for so long. But there's a lot that can be learned. If philanthropy is supposed to be a human phenomenon, something that we all do, why is it that the scholarship and the conventional thinking and the public image of it is still very much a limited, restricted, white elite face? That philanthropy doesn't belong to just one group, it belongs to all of us. And so part of my work is trying to uncover those traditions and those practices and bring them forward to see how they might impact us today.
And when you talk about this, it's interesting to me. Indianapolis is a unique place in terms of what the Lilly family, the Lilly endowment, those gifts that came from the Lilly family, both in endowing places that preserve history, Indiana Historical Society, Indiana Landmarks. And that makes a huge difference because it means that there's always been something in the DNA about the Indiana Historical Society. Part of it is Gail Thornborough and getting that gift and knowing that Mr. Lilly was her advocate. I think that there were some people who weren't sure a woman should be in that role, and he pushed for that. But there's also her sister, Emmylou Thornborough, who is really one of the pioneers of writing about Black Indiana history. The first books I ever read about Black people in Indiana was an Emmylou Thornborough book that one of my parents' friends gave to me when I was doing some research for a college paper. But for that, I don't know that we would know much of what we know now. But it also leads me to think about Wilma Moore,
Yes.
and the role that she played for both of us.
Yes, absolutely. Wilma's a companion, right? You come into this place and she'll take you into the archives. She'll sit with you. She'll go through folders with you. You say, hey, I'm thinking about this, but I'm not sure where. So, oh, check out this box or this folder, right? And you know, she would help you process and think about the things you were seeing and give you other connected collections you might check out for some more context. And then she'd come and say, hey, will you write about this for the magazine? And, you know, create other platforms for you to expand and share your work. So I think anybody and all the people who wrote these books would have interacted with her, right? That anybody who came during that time would have benefited from her counsel. And I think that graciousness, that knowledge, that generosity extends across the staff of IHS, because whether they're getting the boxes for you or they're welcoming you at the front door, it is a hospitable and warm, welcoming place where you can come and be comfortable in doing the research and doing the work.
Yeah, I mean, because we've been to many archives around the country, and
Yes.
some are more welcoming than others.
Yes.
But this is a place where I always feel that we are being welcomed and we're learning something. I mean, really, you know, Wilma, the late Wilma Moore, was always so gracious, and this was, you know, email, I guess we were emailing at that point, but even before email, we were going through it. And I thought, I know the collection. Wilma really knew the collection. Yes. But one of my sort of most special moments was Wilma bringing to me, when I was starting to do research about my grandmother's biological family, Wilma bringing to me the Register of Negroes and Mulattoes from Orange County. Wow. And my grandmother, great-grandmother, and great-great-grandmother were listed, and there was Samira, 5-foot-tall mulatto. Wow. And I thought, well, I guess that could have been me. But to actually see your family, even though it was under the circumstances of free people of color had come to Indiana from North Carolina because they were really being chased out of North Carolina after some of the slave uprisings. But once they got to Indiana, which, you know, Indiana folks like to say we were not a slave state, but they were a state that really circumscribed the lives of Black people. And so that people had to literally register every year. Yeah. And so this register of Negroes and Mulattoes included some of my family members. And so I just have I can still see that moment when Wilma said, well, you might want to check this out. I mean, and that is the sort of the art of being an archivist, of being a curator, is really helping scholars and researchers find something that they didn't already know about.
Yeah, especially when we're talking about those collections, again, that have been ignored or denied. You know, you mentioned, you know, slavery and free people, and it just reminds me how so much of the early scholarship in slavery was written from the perspective of the owners, the plantation owners, and using their documents to cast judgments and understandings about what was going on. And if an owner had written, oh, you know, my slaves are dancing and singing, they must be enjoying this, right?
Hell yeah, because they were contented.
That's right. That's how you get Florida talking about there were benefits, right? Right. But you know, I'm thinking about scholars like John Blossingame, who came along in the 1970s and published The Slave Community. And he used documents from enslaved people, and he took us inside their minds, their lives, their family structures. They're very concerned about family and unity and marriage and community and looking after each other on the plantation, giving us a completely different view of what was actually going on. So again, it's important to have these documents, these artifacts directly from these communities, because you can't rely upon the marginalizing mainstream's documents, right, to tell their stories. You need to get as close to them as possible. And this is why a colleague and I have written about liberating the archive. Dr. Kim Williams-Pulver, we wrote an article with that title because it very much was this challenge of how do you tell Black philanthropic stories? You can't rely upon the traditional sources that most philanthropy scholarship is based on. You have to go into these communities, you have to understand their perspectives, their language, their cultures of giving, and use that as the lens, and then build archives to try to get at that story, and kind of layer these things together, of course, with the help of secondary sources, the appropriate secondary sources. Other books that have been written about this, for me, that was Black women's history.
Right.
And I always like to raise up the hashtag of the Black Women's Historians, hashtag cite a sister, right? Because my work wouldn't be possible without
Right.
them, and you included in that, right? But they had already been studying Black women. They've been studying the club women and the church women and the activists and the abolitionists and all these, they had the theories and the frameworks, right? So my task became looking at those and saying, how does that help me bring forward the philanthropy in this story? So all of these speak to the collaborations, but it goes back to having those documents in order to have the foundation to work
And having somebody who is in these places who really cares about it and who has taken the time to learn. Just having Susan Hall Dotson here.
Yes,
And
yes.
Susan is really looking all over the state at telling these stories. I know that you were just on a panel with her at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History.
Yeah, well, she and some of our colleagues from the Africana Studies Department and Kisha Tandy from the State Museum and Michelle Hayes from the community, they were on a panel. I was in the audience, and they were just doing a dynamite job of talking about the Black arts movement here in Indianapolis and some of the figures and people that were active and engaged there. But again, it speaks to, again, carrying this history forward and speaking and engaging. And I should say that one of the things that was particularly important about that gathering, which also reflects what you're talking about, is that particular association, you will have a panel where you would have a PhD who's the chair of a department, but you'd also have the family genealogist, the independent community historian, the history buff, all together, right? Because that's how Black history was done, right? We weren't allowed in the university. The early generations of Black historians weren't allowed to earn PhDs and study history in the formal ways, right? But they were from the community, they were intellectually curious, and they did the work to create important volumes to help begin trying to cast out what is this history of these enslaved people and how do we make sense of it. It's later when you start getting your Du Boises and your Woodsons and your Anna Julian Coopers who go into the academy and get those degrees and then start helping to formalize that study and making it scientific. But we've always relied upon our griot tradition, right? To keep these histories going. And we certainly see that with your family and everything that you've heard about growing up and were able to see firsthand too.
Yeah, no, people want to tell their stories. They want, but they felt that nobody really cared about it. But so people were considered amateur historians, and even though they were doing the work, but they were not part of the academy. But even with Woodson, John Hope Franklin, when John Hope Franklin, who was working on his PhD at Harvard, was doing his dissertation, doing research for his dissertation in the North Carolina State Archives, he was made to sit in a separate room.
Sure.
There was a whites-only room, but he still persevered and wrote a book on free people of North Carolina, which directly relates to the people who came from North Carolina to Indiana. So he did some of that foundational work. But yeah, he was excluded, but he went on to become the premier historian. But from the 1800s, there were people who were writing history, but they were not being published by the mainstream press.
Right. We were talking about this, right? A lot of America learned about 1619 on the 400th anniversary in 2019, thanks to Nicole Hannah-Jones and the New York Times and the big story there and the subsequent books and things that have come out. But that wasn't where I learned about it. And I know that wasn't where you learned about it, right? I learned about it 10 years old reading Lerone Bennett Jr.'s Before the Mayflower book, the first page, 1619, bam. And he wrote that book in 1961, right? But even before then, Du Bois was writing about 1619, 100 years ago. And one of the earliest recorded notations comes from a book that's entitled A History of the Negro Race from 1619 to 1880, published in 1882 by George Washington Williams, who's considered by some to be the first person to write a comprehensive history of Black America. So we've known about this, right? Black folks have known about this, right? But the larger America didn't. And that's really a travesty when you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, people are, my 50th reunion from North Central High School was a few years ago. And we were planning it during the pandemic. So we were on Zoom, and we happened to be on Zoom around the time of the centennial of the Tulsa massacre. And I happened to be the only Black person on the committee. This was because I'd been a student council member. So we were all talking, and they knew that I was interested in history, that some of my classmates. And they were talking about the Tulsa massacre, and they said, well, did you know about that? And I'm like, well, yeah, but I taught myself about that in the process of doing history. But I just had this sense that they felt, sort of lied to and betrayed, that they did not learn that history, and that they're curious. They wanted to know more, and I think we're seeing that happen again. And I think when I look at, for instance, the Children's Museum, they are very courageous about things like they had an Emmett Till exhibit. They have a permanent exhibit with Anne Frank and Ryan White and Ruby Bridges and Malala. So it takes courage to do these exhibits. And right now at the Indiana Historical Society, the exhibit is Resist, fighting back against the Ku Klux Klan. How to frame that so that it is accessible to people, so they could see that when the Klan was rising in Indiana, that students at Notre Dame really resisted it. They were Catholic students, so they were, in the crosshairs of the Ku Klux Klan. But the story takes a wider lens and also looks at the Jewish community, the African American community in Indianapolis, in Indiana, and how people were fighting back. One of the people who's featured in that exhibit is Dr. Joseph Ward, who was Madam Walker's doctor, who was a member of the Knights of Pythias, who welcomed her to Indianapolis. But I recently did a podcast interview with his great-granddaughter.
Oh, wow.
And she was telling me a story that when her mother was a student at Shortridge in the 1940s, there was a history class assignment, and the teacher said to her, well, Alice, you don't have to do this because, Black people don't really have any history. And she went home just heartbroken and told her mother, Dr. Ward's wife, that what the teacher had said. Well, her mother was, incensed, and she went in the attic and started pulling out all of these boxes with stories about her grandfather, just telling her, you do in fact have a history, but that history was just not taken seriously.
Yeah, and we've got to really push back against this and this whole idea that I didn't know. Well, we have to educate ourselves, as you said. And it reminds me, I was just in Greensboro, North Carolina recently, and I had a chance to visit the Civil Rights Museum there, which is in the old Woolworth store. People remember from the 1960 student sit-in launched by the students from North Carolina A&T and the Bennett Bells from Bennett College. They were two HBCUs, right? And you've probably seen the footage where they went in, it was segregated. They were not allowed as Black people to sit down and be served, and they went in and demanded to be served, and they ended up protesting, and it became a major movement that incorporated over 70,000 students across the South at countertops all over the South, and really helped propel the movement forward, and also to help bring down Jim Crow. And so seeing that story, you can go and you can see the actual countertops and the stools and that sort of thing. But one of the artifacts that really grabbed my attention was a Coca-Cola machine. And it was a two-sided Coca-Cola machine. Traditional red with the white Coca-Cola brand and all that, as you would recognize. And the docent told us it had two faces because there was a white side and a black side.
Wow.
And even though it was the same Coke made in the same factory, driven on the same truck, put in the same machine, Jim Crow said white folks need to get theirs from one side and Black folks from the other. And they couldn't tell us, they said, which one was which. They knew that's how it operated, but there were stickers on it. One side said 5 cents, the other side said 10 cents. So which one do you think?
Well, what do you think?
Yeah, right, which goes back to Madam Walker's story, right, of having to pay more to go into the same movie experience as white patrons.
And that's
right?
that's a document here
Yeah.
that both of us were able to develop, several pages in books and in articles about that one document. But that's sort of the importance of a document in telling a story, in verifying a story, and then using as a platform to expand. So that particular story, I ran across, it was just one page of a lawsuit that must have been filed by F.B. Ransom. Madam Walker went to the ISIS theater. She loved movies, and the lawsuit, the claim said that she was asked to pay 25 cents when she had been accustomed to paying 5 cents. And the poor young ticket taker was doing just what she was told and said, well, it's that much for colored people now.
Yeah.
And Madam Walker went back to her office, talked to her attorney, and they filed a lawsuit. I don't know what ever happened to that because I've never been able to discover whether there was a settlement or just making noise and bringing the law, speaking truth to power, whether that was enough. But that allowed me to have a window on what her life was like, despite all of her privilege.
Yes.
That
Didn't matter.
and we think that that is the inspiration for the theater that's now in the Madam Walker Legacy Center. Her experience, both loving film, but also realizing that films were segregated or people were being asked to pay more money.
Right. I mean, could you imagine what she was like when she came back? She was probably fuming, right?
She had to have been.
But you know, it gets back to these narratives, right? We have to question what we're being told and understand these stories because, again, according to the docent, that Coca-Cola machine is not a part of the story you get when you go to Atlanta to the Coca-Cola official museum.
Yes, they're a wonderful museum, but that's not
Wonderful
there.
museum, right? That's what they said is not there, right? So we have to be, aware of these kinds of things, and there are so many resources. You don't have to be somebody who says, "Well, I didn't know."
Right.
Right. There's so many avenues for you to know now, and IHS, by holding these kinds of collections, makes that also more possible.
Well, yeah, and you should know. People should want to know, but it's just stunning to me that there are people who don't want the story told, like Ruby Bridges. Like, we don't want to tell Ruby Bridges' story of integrating schools in New Orleans. But so what is the danger to people? Because from my perspective, just like the exhibit here, just like the Resist exhibit and the Klan, you can identify with the people who resisted, and I guess there's some people who will identify with the Klan. In the story of Ruby Bridges, you can identify with the marshals who were escorting her, or you can identify with the mothers who were screaming at her. But there is a moral judgment to be made, and many people do not want to hear that moral judgment.
Yes, yes, and that kind of history came full circle for me because a few years ago we were privileged. Miss Bridges came here to Indianapolis to visit with us at IUPUI at the School of Philanthropy, and she has a foundation and she wanted some advice about running the foundation. And so it was incredible to see this woman walk into our department and sit down and meet with us. I ran and I got my daughter out of school so she could meet her. We got a great picture, but this is an example, right? And some of these great historical heroes are still here, right? And they're trying to tell their stories, and yet they're in danger of being banned or denied access to. And we just have to really ask us the cost of that, and again, what we're going to miss out on if those bans and those other restrictions succeed.
Well, with all the things that are going on now, the collections that are here, the exhibits that are here, there's still more that can be done. And so, I think about ways to continue to expand the collection. One of the things that is sort of a dream of mine is to do StoryCorps, to have their little trailer come and have people come in, families come in and tell their stories. And, not just African American families all over Indianapolis, to say this is a family day and people come in, a grandmother and a grandchild, and they exchange stories. Or a day when you can bring in your family photographs, not to necessarily donate to the Historical Society, but to have them scanned. But I think that then plants the seeds for them to understand, your stories are valued. Or the way that the National Museum of African American History and Culture they did kind of an antiques roadshow where they would just have people bring your family heirlooms, and we'll look at them, we'll talk to you about them, but that helps to begin to educate people about donating their papers or including their papers. Because, I talk to friends and I say, where are you giving your papers? People are very accomplished people, and they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you talking
Who wants
about?
my
But
stuff? Yeah.
we could never have told the stories and written the books that we've written if somebody hadn't 100 years ago, 150 years ago, given their papers or scrapbooks to a place like the Indiana Historical Society.
Absolutely, it's critical. So we have to that's another thing for folks to think about. What are you going to do with your papers? And now I guess increasingly your social media profiles, right? That's a whole other thing. Can you imagine if Madam Walker had Instagram? I mean,
she would definitely have been on Instagram and TikTok, all over.
Right. Dancing and everything, right?
Right. Oh, God.
But yeah, we definitely have to keep generating resources for the Historical Society and preserving these collections, because that is the key for telling these stories. Really.
100 years from now. So we have this century of stories to tell.
Yes.
Tyrone, this has been fun.
Yes.
I could talk to you for 5 more hours, but I'm so glad that we have been brought together by Madam Walker's story, and I really hope that there are many people who will hear this who will be doing their own research on their families or who will come to the Indiana Historical Society to see what's here, to see what stories they can tell on their own.
Yes, and I share that sentiment, and so grateful for you and all the trails you've blazed through that archive and opening up these stories. And you're right, I hope that others will be inspired and will take it to the next level. What else can we learn about Madam and the wards and Indianapolis and other parts of the state? The documents are here, so you're welcome to come, right?
Exactly. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Jody, and thank you for all of the supporters of the Indiana Historical Society.
Thank you.